All right. Sorry for the little delay. Had some things I had to make sure we're working here on the back end. So before we kind of get going here today, so we'll get through the rest of Module 13 material probably pretty quickly here today. I'll then probably jump into those practice exams and focus on some Module 13 questions just so we get some more practice at kind of how we see this material applied. The only thing left that we're going to have is you're going to see kind of a quiz 13 pop up here when I get back to my office today around 11, between 11 and 11:30. It'll be the last module quiz. That's due at the end of the day, Monday. All right, so this is the last week of new material that we have. Okay. Once that due date passes, I'll kind of have it, and I think I misspoke on Tuesday, that I'll drop your two lowest quizzes. Okay, so I'll update Canvas probably on Tuesday of next week to have that reflected. Right now, it's reflecting I'm dropping your lowest module reading. We have no more module readings left this semester. After today, we'll have the last in-class quiz. So when I get back to my office, I'll kind of update Canvas so that it's dropping your four lowest in-class quizzes. Okay. And I'll mention something at the end of the class about this as well. So the other thing I wanted to mention, I'll get an announcement posted up about this with just all of the details. But I mentioned Tuesday, I just want to kind of solidify some things. So our exam is this date and time in the syllabus. So that's Wednesday, I believe, from 8 to 10 on finals week. So I think it's the 6th of May. We will be in biology, which is like the building right next to this, right? And I think it's room 124. Okay. So I'm going to be split between two exams that day or two locations. I have another section and they have the same time. So there'll be a lot of proctors there. And the same procedures will kind of apply as for the previous two in-class exams. Although we'll have 2 hours, there'll be 30 questions. So a few more questions. That's why the final is weighted a little bit more. And also you have more time though. So you have more time actually per question, right? So time should be a little bit less of an issue on this final. I will not be starting out with you guys. I'll be in a different location, making sure they get things started. And then I'll kind of come in about, I don't know, a quarter of the way through. I'll kind of remain there for about half of the time and then kind of go back to that other location to end the exam. So if you have any questions at any point, any of the proctors can kind of answer those questions, but I will be there once again, probably from like 10:30 to 11, 10:30. From 8:30 to 9:30, this is the first 30 minutes, the last 30 minutes, I won't be in that location. Okay. They have my phone number, email. I'll keep an eye on my phone. If I'm not in the room when you have a question and they're not sure how to answer it, I'll be available, right, to contact them. Okay. So I'll get all these kind of details up in an announcement on Canvas. I'll probably get this posted tomorrow. But I wanted to kind of make it aware for those of you who are here today. Okay. We also have that kind of fifth final Canvas discussion. Where did I put it? Here it is. All right. So let's do it at the end of the day next Wednesday. All right. I mentioned also, and I'll post an announcement just to be clear. I've mentioned this several times, but we don't have class on Tuesday. I'm going to post up a video, me working through some review problems just like we typically would. And then next Thursday, we'll have just a review session in here in class where you can ask any questions over old quizzes, old practice problems, or the practice exams. So that's kind of what the end of the semester looks like here. Okay. Also, I mentioned this last class, but just to be clear again, and it's in the instructions, but this discussion, you need 4 components. You need 2 original posts, right? There's kind of 2 prompts, 2 links of kind of how to using that generative AI tool to get your response, then evaluating that response as instructed kind of by the assignment, and then you'll respond to 2 other students' responses, okay? So for a total of 4 things, this looks just like all the other Canvas discussions. You need a total of 4 things. 2 original posts, 2 replies to other students. Okay. Any other questions for me before we just dive into material here? Should be all the kind of housekeeping stuff. Okay. So let's get back where we left off. Okay. So a couple of terms that we were using last class, and we'll kind of use them again today, mainly focus on this second one. But we said when we have these monopolist competitive markets, they're kind of a mashup of perfectly competitive and monopolists, right? So we talked a lot about last class, how we solve for the optimal price, solve for the optimal quantity, identify the markup, identify excess capacity. And then we said, unlike a monopolist, these perfectly competitive firms, we care about the short run because they can have positive or negative profits. Monopolists always had positive profits, so we didn't really have to worry about that shutdown decision, right? In the short run, if we have positive or negative profits, firms then had the decision, do I stay open or shut down? This looked very similar to a perfectly competitive firm. I stay open if price is above average variable cost. I shut down if it's not. Okay. So we'll think about some of the things that could change for the firm today that would change their quantity, their price decision, and their resulting profits, as well as this markup. So the definition of our markup was simply the difference between the price that that monopolistically competitive firm is setting and their marginal costs. Okay. So we talked through a little bit about the welfare implications last class. So today we'll dive a little bit deeper into thinking about how these issues become a little more complicated in the real world. And we'll kind of break them down piece by piece. So first, I've kind of got advertising in here, right? So we think about, why does a firm advertise? What do they hope they're doing? Why would you spend money on advertising? You hope that more people want to. Guys, if you're in the Kelley School of Business, we gotta have this down. You advertise because you hope people want to buy your product, right? That's the whole purpose. You're spending tons of money on marketing. Why? You think that you're going to get a larger portion of the overall demand curve. Essentially, when we have these monopolist competitive firms, we said they don't face the entire demand. That's what a monopolist would do. They're only getting a small portion of it, right? So if we think about what implications is this going to have, right? If I advertise, the first thing that we want to determine is, okay, I'm advertising. Hopefully it's effective and I get a larger portion of the overall demand curve. So if I do that, what is that going to do in our models, right? So if I've got kind of my marginal costs, right? I've got my demand curve, and then we said these monopolistically competitive firms face a twice as steep marginal revenue. So this is kind of where we start out. We said we solve these. It looks very similar to a monopolist, right? So we identify the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to, once again, every firm makes this decision the same way. We set the optimal quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, right? Now, like a monopolist, because they have some market power, the monopolistically competitive firm, so this is kind of our first step. Second step is we said we go up to the demand curve to set our price, right? So we go up to the demand curve. Here would be kind of the initial price they set, okay? We're not going to worry about the markup right now. I'll draw this out again just so we don't have too many things going on in the same graph. But let's assume I've got an average total cost curve that looks something like that. So the next thing we can do is, okay, we've set the optimal price and quantity. What is the value of profit? So I had someone ask me the other day, what does pi represent? Well, this is where we're reusing things throughout the whole semester. Pi is how I've always been writing profits. It goes back to like module 9 or 10. We started kind of writing this. So it's the quantity I'm selling times that difference between price and average total cost. So where is my average total cost at that quantity that I'm choosing to produce? Looks like it's right about here. So this would kind of represent our initial starting profits. Price is above average total cost, so my profits would be what? Positive. Now, I'm going to do something a little bit different than kind of how we would set up advertising. So advertising, we would think, hopefully should increase the demand for my product because I'm getting a higher portion of the overall demand curve. Now, I've got some questions in the practice exam where we'll work through that. We could do this in either direction. So I'm going to show you instead, let's think about what happens if I advertise, but other firms don't. What's going to happen to demand for those other firms who aren't advertising this product? So if I advertise, but more people even know that my product exists, they might not know that these other firms' products exist. I'm going to get a higher portion of demand. Well, if I increase the proportion of demand I get from 20 to 50%, what happens to the percent that every other firm gets? Has to go down. So let's think about what would happen to the other firms, the ones not advertising. They would have a decrease in their demand curve. Right? So just thinking through the intuition, if the demand for my product decreases, what's going to happen? Do you think I can sell more or less units than before? Less. So intuitively, we would think quantity is going to go down. If I get a smaller portion of the overall demand curve, it's like I have less market power. What do you think is going to happen to the price I can set? It's also going to go down. Well, if price and quantity go down, what's definitely going to happen to profits? If two things in an equation go down, profits are going to go down. All right. So if I think about this here, and I'm going to draw it pretty extreme, but let's say the slope of the demand curve, I try to draw it here so it doesn't change, but I still have kind of this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. Well, now when the firm makes this profit decision of where to set that quantity, where am I maximizing profits, marginal revenue will equal marginal cost at this lower quantity. My costs are still the same, but other firms have kind of stole some of my market share by advertising. So I then go up to my demand curve to set my price. Sure enough, what has happened? When I see a demand decrease in my product, my price and quantity both go down. Now, we know that from the equation, profits will go down, but the visual is, what's the difference now between price and my average total cost? Well, now that average total cost is higher than the price I'm setting. So this would represent my profits, but my profits are going to be what? Negative. So if I'm the only firm that doesn't advertise, I'm going to see a decrease in my profits. So what is their incentive for every firm to do? Advertise. What does this sound similar to? Nash equilibrium's game theory. We end up with a prisoner's dilemma because if everybody's advertising, we're all offsetting each other's efficiency. We're all going to have the same exact demand as before, but what have we done by advertising? Jacked up our costs. So the next thing that we'll look at is what happens if we all advertise, nobody gets an increase or decrease in demand, but all we've done is simply increase our costs. So we'll go to that next. But before we do, any kind of questions on thinking about how these demand shifts are going to impact the firm? So here I'm breaking it down to different components. So here, let's just assume this is the firm that didn't advertise. So what's going to happen to their costs? They're not going to change, right? So here we just saw that they had a decrease in demand. So here we're just trying to understand, and this would be a question I could ask you on the exam. I have the exam written and printed, so ask you this on the exam. How would that demand increase or decrease impact the firm's either quantity, price, or corresponding profits? I won't ever combine a demand shift with an average total cost shift. I might break those down into two different questions, but this would be kind of just be one question. Just how does that increase or decrease in demand impact the firm? Does that answer your question? Any other questions on this before we then kind of add in that second component? So I'm not going to draw it out, but you can think about, okay, well, the firm that advertised, they saw an increase in demand. So what's going to happen to them? The exact opposite of everything, right? They increase their quantity, they increase their price, and they would see profits go up. Okay. So that might sound okay. I should be advertising, right? If I do, I increase my profits. If I don't, I decrease my profits. So let's think about the other component, though, that's going on simultaneously if I do choose to advertise. So I know if I advertise, no one else does, I'll increase my profits. Okay? So let's even assume nobody else advertises. Is spending money on marketing and advertising worth it, right? So we're going to put this on a separate graph and think about, okay, let's say I've got this demand curve. I've got a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, and here's my marginal costs, okay? Now, just to revisit some concepts that we've talked about before, if I look at the profit maximizing quantity, that's where marginal revenue is equal to my marginal cost. I then go up to the demand curve to set my price. Okay. What must be true about the elasticity of demand that a monopoly or a monopolistically competitive firm face? Well, what is always going to be true as long as I have some marginal costs, marginal revenue is always going to be a positive value. So we said if marginal revenue is ever positive, what portion of the demand curve are we on? Someone said it, elastic, right? So just like a monopolist, these monopolistic competitive firms will always be on some elastic portion of the demand curve. Okay? Just revisiting some concepts. And then at that profit maximizing quantity, what is my marginal cost? That difference, didn't leave myself a lot of room here, would be our markup. Okay? So they're setting the price above what their marginal cost is. That tells us we have some inefficiencies in the market. The perfectly competitive firm, we end up at this point in the long run where everything's equal, right? Price is equal to marginal revenue, is equal to marginal cost, is equal to average total cost, is equal to the minimum point. So that would be an efficient market, perfectly competitive. Here, that price is not equal to my marginal revenue, marginal cost. In fact, above that, so we have kind of this markup that's causing some inefficiencies or a loss of surplus, which we looked at last class. So kind of reviewing some old things there, we're now going to add in, okay, what did advertising do? All right. So let's think about an initial scenario where I had this initial average total cost curve. So what would profits be? That difference between price and average total cost times the quantity I'm producing. Remember, profits are simply the quantity I'm selling times the difference. This is almost like our per unit profits, because every unit I sell, I keep the price. Every unit I produce, average total cost is my per unit cost. So this would be my initial profits, right? And here they're positive. Price is above average total cost. Now, if I advertise, if we just think about the effects of spending money in advertising, this is the idea that if everyone advertises, I don't get an increase in my demand, right? All I get, if everybody advertises, well, I have the same demand curve, same marginal costs. I'm going to end up at the same price and quantity. So nothing kind of changes in terms of the price and the quantity I can set because everybody's marketing offsets each other. But by putting a lot of money into advertising and marketing, I mean, think about like a Super Bowl ad. What does that cost? A lot of money. The key difference is what kind of cost is advertising? If I produce nothing and I spent all this money on a Super Bowl ad, or I produce 1 million units and I spent all this money, it doesn't change. So if it doesn't change with the quantity I'm producing, it would be a fixed cost. Someone said sunk, but that's the idea, right? I could pay it no matter what. So it's a fixed cost. So if I think about what is that going to do? All I've done, whatever my cost of productions were before, my marginal costs are the same. But I now am spending all of this money on advertising. I'd essentially get kind of like this increase in my average total cost curve. Well, the price I can set hasn't changed, right? Everyone's advertising, we're offsetting each other. But notice now that price relative to where my average total cost is now less than average total cost. So this would represent my profits, difference between price and average total costs, times the quantity I'm producing. But now profits are going to be what? Negative. So if I don't get any higher or lower portion of the overall demand curve, but I have to spend all this money, intuitively, what's going to happen? Profits are going to go down. I have no more market power. I have no higher of a market share. I'm selling the same unit at the same price, but I now have this additional cost. That's going to hurt my profits. Okay? So this is going to be kind of like an example of a prisoner's dilemma in the sense that, well, everybody has an incentive to spend money on marketing. Demand curve doesn't change, but we've all increased our costs, right? So this would be kind of the impacts of simply an increase in our costs that are just a fixed cost. I just shifts that average total cost curve. We're going to end up seeing we could go from positive to negative profits. So if there's this incentive that there are negative profits, what will some firms do as we move towards the long run? Profits are negative. Some firms will exit the market. What happens if firms exit the market? The demand that each firm faces will go up, increases in demand will push those profits back up until they're equal to 0. Okay. So, in the meantime, companies are losing money, right? As firms enter and exit, we get back to this point where economic profits are 0. Okay. Any questions on either of these ideas before we keep moving? So if I asked you on the exam, I'd only ever break it down to one of these two components. Okay? I won't kind of put them together. In the real world, well, not everybody's advertising. Like this might be bad news for marketing majors, right? You're like, oh shit, I chose this thing that doesn't matter, right? It might actually hurt firms. Well, if your marketing is more efficient than another firm's, yes, you'll decrease profits by increasing your costs. But if my marketing is more efficient, I'm going to get a higher portion of the overall demand, so I could offset that by increasing my profits. Now, if everybody's marketing is equally efficient, well, then I can't increase the overall demand. Then we kind of have this like prisoner's dilemma example. But that's why companies spend a lot of money, pay lots of people in their marketing departments, because if I can come up with efficient ad campaigns that are better than other firms, I can get a higher portion of the overall demand curve and increase my profit despite having to spend money on that. Okay. Any questions on this idea? Oh, where are we at in time? Let me think what I want to do here. So I want to go through one more thing. So what's happened to the markup from these cost changes? The difference between price and marginal cost is still the same. Or we didn't change our price decision, our marginal cost didn't change. Before we move on to the kind of last thing, there is something I wanted to revisit in terms of what happens if we see demand shifts. Okay. And here I'll do the opposite. So let's say we started out, here's my demand curve, here's my initial marginal revenue curve, and maybe here's my marginal costs. So we're not going to worry in this graph about profits. So I'm going to make a different point. We already talked about how profits were impacted by demand shifts. So we're now going to think about how are markups impacted by demand shifts. Well, just intuitively, if I think about my initial starting point is where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, I go up to the demand curve to then set my price. My marginal cost at that quantity is down here. So this would be my initial markup. If I can get a higher portion of the overall demand curve, do you think that my markup, and kind of think about the firm's markup is kind of good, right? I'm selling this now at a price that's well above my marginal cost. So if I see a demand increase, do you think the markup's going to go up or down? Up. So we'll kind of see that play out with our visual, because let's draw this really extreme just to kind of make this point. So if I see an increase in my overall demand curve, maybe my marketing was really efficient, and then I've got this twice as steep marginal revenue curve, well, what's going to happen? Well, that demand increased my quantity. That's what we were saying before, even without the visual. What price can I now set? I go up to the demand curve. Here's this new price that I'm setting. And my marginal cost value would be right here. So what's happened to my markup? I mean, I try to draw this to scale, right? It has went up, right? And the reason why, for some of these are maybe a little more math-minded, you don't need to know this in terms of like the exam. All you would need to know on the exam is, if I see demand increases, what's that going to do to my markup? It should increase it. And then the reverse. If demand decreases, what's going to happen to my markup? Well, I'm just working in the opposite direction, so there it would decrease. But the reason why is because if I think about marginal revenue, we said it's always twice as steep as demand. So if I think about like at a quantity of, make this easy, 10, maybe the point I'm at on the demand curve would be 10, so the point I'd be at on the revenue curve would be 5, right? It's twice as steep, so it falls twice as quick. Well, if I go up to a quantity of 20, right? Maybe there I'd be at a price of 20, but only a market revenue of 10. As I kind of see that out, that difference, right, between my demand and marginal revenue curve, what's happening to that difference? It's getting larger. That's just math, right? If one of them has a twice as steep or a slope that's twice as steep, that gap is going to get larger as we start to increase whatever's on that x-axis. Any questions on this idea before I have one more kind of new thing that we'll look at? Okay. So just to kind of round out our discussion before we look at this final thing, right? So I kind of already talked through some of these, but like critiques of advertising would be we're just increasing our total costs, right? Which is going to hurt profits. And if everybody does that, well, no firm is getting any higher portion of the overall demand curve. So it's going to be worse for all firms. Now, there's also kind of additional critique we could think about. The demand curve should represent what consumers' marginal benefits are. Let's think about maybe like a negative externality almost. Sometimes when I watch ad campaigns, I see things I'm like, oh, that like, kind of how they're dating now, but like QVC ads, like where they like run these things like, here's the new egg slicer, peeler, whatever. You're like, man, I would use that all the time. You buy it and it sits in your kitchen cabinet forever. You never use it, right? What did they do? They made you think the marginal benefit of that product to you was higher than it actually is. So what were you willing to do? Pay higher price. What was the actual marginal benefit? Much lower than that. So essentially, they've created negative consumer surplus. Right? They've kind of taken advantage of consumers. So that would be a critique of advertising, is all we're really doing. Maybe the marginal benefit of my product, it's still whatever it was before. I've just convinced consumers that it's higher. Right? So that would give these firms some more market power, in which case we could go from something that should be a perfectly competitive market to something that's more monopolistically competitive. Okay? We kind of like draw this out. The defense would be, maybe the reverse is true. Maybe consumers don't realize how beneficial this product is, and they should actually be buying more of it. So through advertising, I make them realize what their actual demand curve is, which means they're now better off than before. Right? So you could go kind of either way. There was one study that was kind of interesting. So they had like, I don't know if it's eyeglasses or if this was like contacts, but basically some states prohibited like advertising for it. So I think they do this in some states for like medical products as well. Like they don't want people manipulating consumers into buying these different medical products. And so they said you can't advertise in this state for eyeglasses or contacts. What they actually found was in those states that prohibited advertising, right? Eyeglasses there actually became more expensive. And so this is the idea that if I can't advertise, right, maybe I can keep consumers from knowing that there's more substitutes. So if they don't know that there's more substitutes, they're going to be more inelastic, giving firms more market power, essentially turning this from what would be a perfectly competitive market if I can see all of the different eyeglasses or contacts that exist, to where now if I only know the major brands, they have more market power, they can increase the price, and that's what we saw in those states. So advertising can help create more competition, move us away from these monopolistically competitive market, closer to a perfectly competitive market. Okay. And then we won't spend too much time on this, but brand names are really the same idea, right? It's just kind of a unique way of advertising. So even if I don't have to spend money, so this is like an ideal world. Let's say where those drawings are doing, I don't have to spend any more money. So my wife's family and I'm now in this are a big Indy 500 fan. So like, what a lot of these like small companies will do. So Connor Daly is one of them. He like works with a bunch of like different companies in Indianapolis. He does it for free. Well, if they don't have to spend any money, but they can get a celebrity, Indiana celebrity endorsement, right, for a certain group of consumers, why have to spend no money, but I can now get a higher portion of overall demand, right? That's going to be a good thing for my product. The brand names are the same thing. Maybe I'm a historic, well-established brand, but if I can get celebrities to simply endorse my product without even having to give them anything, right? Maybe just because I have connections to them. Well, I can now create a brand that people want to buy because they saw their favorite musician wear it or whatever it is. Well, I've now increased my overall demand curve without having to spend any additional money. we're going to see their profits go up. We kind of already looked at those in terms of like demand shifters. Okay. And then kind of same critiques of brands. We won't really go through this. These are some kind of throwaway slides. We've kind of already discussed this. Brand names and advertising really work hand in hand. Now, one thing that could happen is maybe I don't spend money on like advertising, but let's say I've got a pretty competitive market, but our products are slightly differentiated, but I come up with a new technology to produce this good that every other firm doesn't have. Okay. So we still have this kind of monopolistically competitive market. Our products are slightly differentiated, but I figure out a way to produce those products at a much lower cost, right? I've maybe put some money into research development. I came up with this great new technology. Okay. So if we have the demand curve of that firm and their marginal revenue, and maybe here was their initial marginal cost, and we'll have a unique scenario here. In the long run, what should be true about a firm's profits in a perfectly or a monopolistic competitive market? We said they get driven down to 0. So when we look at that profit maximizing quantity, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, we go up here to where they're setting the price. If it is in the long run, what must be true is that we're hitting that average total cost such that our profit equation is quantity times price minus average total cost. So we said if profits are 0, the only way that happens is if I leave the market and produce nothing, or if price is exactly equal to my average total cost. Right? So we start out here, profits are 0. Okay. If I'm the only firm that cannot, figure out this new technology for produce, or maybe it doesn't have to be a new technology, maybe I identify a group of workers that I can pay less money to, right? What have I done? I've not lowered my fixed costs, but I've lowered my variable or my marginal costs. So if I decrease my marginal costs, well, consequently, if it costs me less for every additional unit, my average total cost curve is going to have to shift as well. So I could end up with something like, and I'm going to try to draw these parallel, like this. So this new technology, or identifying this cheaper labor force, I've decreased, right, my marginal and average total cost. So what's going to happen if that's the case? Well, where's the new profit maximizing point? Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Once again, I think these results will be pretty intuitive. If I can decrease my marginal costs, or how much it costs me to produce something, am I going to want to produce more or less than before? All else equal, I want to produce more. Right? My costs are lower. I'm going to want to produce more than I was previously. There's going to be some units that weren't profitable before that now are. Now, I'll go up. This is where it's a little bit of a counterintuitive result. Because even though I've lowered my costs, what could happen to the price? Price actually goes down here. Right? So this is the idea that, what really matters when we're talking about profits, it's both the quantity I'm selling and the price that I'm charging. Well, I wouldn't ask you this maybe on the exam, but just to kind of have a more heuristic view and revisit some concepts that you could know. We said demand is always going to be elastic. So what did that imply? That the percentage change in quantity was greater than the percentage change in price, because that was our elasticity. If we just rearrange this, this is what elastic demand means. So if I decrease the price by a little bit here, what's going to happen is I'm going to get a huge response in quantity. So what's going to happen to profits? They'll increase, right? So it's kind of a counterintuitive result that if I can lower my costs, I'm going to produce more units. I'm going to sell them at a lower price, which sounds like a bad thing. But because we know they're always on the elastic portion of the demand, we know that price decrease will always be smaller than that quantity increase. And so our resulting profits should increase. We can see that here because what were my profits before? 0. At this new price, where am I at on the new average total cost curve? Down here. Now, the difference between price and average total cost times the quantity I'm producing. Now I've actually got positive profits. Okay. So this would be, I think, the most kind of counterintuitive result here is that if I am able to lower my marginal costs, I can end up seeing the firm actually charge a lower price than before. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. So we'll revisit this since everybody's here today. Well, not everybody. Those of you who are here today, I should say. Maybe not participating in as many little 5 activities last night, so that's why you're here, right? So, well, get to this pretty quick. We got the next 9 minutes here. So I think the code is 10.20 or 1020. So this should show up under the main homepage or under the quizzes tab. Last in class quiz. We'll kind of think through this question. It's a little bit deviates from what we've talked about today, but something that I wanted to kind of revisit. Okay. Is that code working for everyone? So 10.20, okay. So let's think about which of the following here is true. Okay. So I've got all these comparisons of monopolist to perfectly competitive to monopolist to competitive markets. So the first thing I want to do is think about if I'm comparing a monopolist to a perfectly competitive market, this might be the easiest comparison, right? The monopoly one's a little bit tricky. So we went through something like this last class, but we said, if I have a perfectly competitive market, I'm a little bit off here. This should be the minimum point. I'm drawing this quickly, but this is the minimum, right? What should be true is, well, the equilibrium price in a perfectly competitive market is the firm's marginal revenue. So we end up at this point where we're at the lowest possible point of our average total cost curve. Profits are equal to 0. Okay. Even if we're in the long run, for a monopolistically competitive firm, profits should still be what? 0. So they don't face this kind of horizontal. You could almost think about this was the demand curve for the firm in a perfectly competitive market. The demand curve for a firm in a monopolistically competitive market is going to look something like this, right? Their marginal revenue curve would be twice as steep. So we know that the monopolistically competitive firm, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, is always less than that of a perfectly competitive firm. Now they go up to the demand curve to set their price. So what's true about the price the monopolistically competitive firm set relative to the perfectly competitive firm? Well, the perfectly competitive firm just takes the market prices given, right? And this is where you can draw this out or just think intuitively. If I have some market power, am I going to be able to charge a higher or lower price than if I had none? Higher. And that's what we see here, right? So when I'm comparing these, the quantity of a perfectly competitive market is always going to be greater than that of a monopolistic competitive market, but the price is going to be lower, okay? Even in the long run when both firms have profits of 0. So those two things will be true. So we'll go back to the question here in a second. Now, the one that's a little bit trickier is thinking about a monopolist relative to a monopolistically competitive firm. So this is where we could draw this out, right? But if I'm comparing a monopolist to a monopolistically competitive firm, we said last class, the monopolist faces the entire demand curve, right? So they make this decision based off of their demand curve and marginal revenue. So the quantity that a monopolist chooses would be way up here. Price is up here. So if I'm comparing this at the firm level, monopolistically competitive firms, well, they're going to only have a much smaller portion of the overall demand curve. So they're always going to end up at lower prices and lower quantities. I mean, if there's one firm, they're going to be producing more than if in that same market there are 100. So at the market level, the monopolist will always choose a higher quantity than a monopolistically competitive firm. But here's where it gets a little tricky. At the market level, where is there more competition? In a monopoly market or a monopolistically competitive market? Well, we said it's a mashup of the two. Monopolist is like the most market power, perfectly competitive the least. If monopolistically competitive market is somewhere in the middle, the monopolist is going to have more market power. So if they have more market power, what's going to happen? They are going to restrict quantity more, and they're going to be able to charge a higher price. Right? So this is where, if we're looking at the market level, the quantity that a monopolist chooses, right, will actually be less than the total quantity we see across all firms in a monopolistically competitive market. Now, if I was comparing a monopolist at the firm level, well, that's where if I'm only one of many, my quantity is always going to be less than a monopolist. So here's kind of the key difference we're making here is when we're comparing quantities of a monopolistically competitive to a monopolist market, it depends on if we're comparing the overall quantity in the market or the quantity of the firm, that direction changes. So if we're thinking about our responses here, we said what? A monopolistically competitive firm will choose a lower quantity than a perfectly competitive market. This is the idea. When there's more market power, you'll see quantity restricted more and prices are going to be set higher. So that one's true, right? Or sorry, yeah, that one's true. So we'll talk to the other one. I wish I had these different orders. So it's going to result in higher prices than the monopolist. Well, who has the most market power? So they can get away with charging the highest price. That one doesn't make any sense. It results in a lower price in the perfectly competitive market. Well, where are prices the lowest? When we have the least amount of market power, the most competition, which was our ideal world of perfect competition. So that one doesn't make sense. We have some market power in a monopolistic competitive market, so we know the price is actually going to be high. We drew it out over there. It results in a lower quantity than a monopoly market. Well, we said at the firm level, I'm only one of many, so my quantity would be lower than a monopolist. But at the market level, because there's more competition, we would actually be adding up the quantity of every single firm to get the market amount. So there, in a monopolistic competitive market, we have a little bit less market power than a monopolist. So they're going to actually end up at a higher quantity when we look at that overall market. So then that last one isn't true either. So the only one we had being true there was that a monopolistic competitive market results in a lower quantity than a perfectly competitive market. Okay. And then the second one, there's no right or wrong answers. Take a minute or so. I think I had this set to be due at 8:48. Think about when I'm making that video, which I'm planning to do tomorrow. I'm going to look at these responses before I do it. And then also kind of guiding my class on the next Thursday when we meet. Which of the 4 modules do you want to see reviewed the most? So monopolistically competitive, monopolies, perfect competition, or kind of that game theory kind of model that we looked at. So just respond, which one do you want to see reviewed the most? We'll get a little bit of review with monopolistically competitive markets today. So just keep that in mind when you're responding to this. Once again, try to get this in the next minute. I've got it set to be due at 8:48. Okay. Any questions on that before we kind of jump back away from this here? Okay. We're good? Okay. All right, so make sure you're hitting submit right now, right? Or in the next, 30 seconds to a minute, right? So we kind of worked through all the slides, right? What I want to do is I've got practice exam. Let's kind of look at A here. We're going to come down here. We got about almost 30 minutes. I think we can work through a pretty good amount of these questions. So we're going to kind of take a step back, probably review some things that we talked about in Tuesday's class, how we would apply those to some actual questions. And this is where I'll try to leave a little bit of time at the end of class to give you some tips as you're studying, and then also mention something maybe important about Thursday's class. So for the people that take the in-class quiz and jet out of here, then we'll get to hear that, right? So if I've got this depiction of a monopolistically competitive firm. Now, we can revisit some concepts here that review a lot of things. Where would the perfectly competitive market end up at? Where supply is equal to demand. What represents my supply? Or what does supply represent? Marginal costs. So if I'm thinking about my marginal costs as supply, that hits demand here at a quantity of 26 and a price of 60. At that price, it's exactly equal to average total cost and the minimum point of my average total cost. So profits are 0. If profits are 0, doesn't have to be the case, but likely what am I in? The long run. I mean, technically, you could have 0 profit in the short run if things are still changing. You kind of see profits oscillate. But what else do I not have on this curve or on this graph? In the short run, I would have an average variable cost curve. If I'm in the long run, and I might throw some questions on the exam like this. If this was a perfectly competitive market, what would the average variable cost be? Well, this is a perfectly competitive market. We just said we're at this point. Average total cost is 60. What are the only costs I have in the long run? Variable costs. So what is my average variable cost here? I'm in the long run 60. Those would be the exact same thing. So I could like write out next to this, ATC is equal to ABC if I'm in the long run. Okay? So pay attention to wording. I bold things on the exam like long, short run that might be important. Okay? But we don't have a perfectly competitive market. We're talking about monopolistic competitive markets, but we're doing review. So we're trying to kind of think about everything here. So what would the profit maximizing quantity and price be? And then the question actually asks for profits, but we need those two things to determine profits. So where do I select? I mean, this has got to be instant when we think about this in the exam. I set the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. I'm getting tired of saying, right? So where is that going to be? It looks like it's at a quantity of 20. So if I'm at this quantity of 20, right, that's where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. The price is 40, right? No. I do this with my 1.5-year-old son, right? I'll tell him it says that's not the right thing, right? So what would be the correct answer? Well, I have to go up to my demand curve to then set the price. Why would I do that? Well, if I set a price at 40, I know consumers are willing and able to pay whatever point I'm at in the demand curve, so why wouldn't I charge them that? So I have some market power, right? I'm a monopolistically competitive firm. So I go up the demand curve and I set the price at 80. So what are the things that we need for a profit equation? Right? So I'll type on here instead of jumping back and forth just to kind of save us some time in our eyes. So profits are equal to the quantity we're selling times the difference between price and average total cost. Okay. So the quantity we said was what? 20. The price we just said was 80. The only thing left we need is our average total cost. We're looking at the average total cost at that profit maximizing quantity of 20. So it looks like we're at this point of 70. Okay. Now on the exam, I won't give you these points where they're like in the middle and you don't have any grid lines, right? So it'll always, that'll help you out kind of thinking about, am I doing this right? You should be finding points that are exactly on a value, right? Not like, right here. Right? So my average total cost is 70. So I plug that in. I get what? 20 times 10 should be 200. Now, even if I was like concerned about the values, I'm like, oh, I don't know if I'm plugging these incorrect. What's one rule I can remember that I know I could rule out B and C right away? Well, if I look at this point, I'm like, oh, the price I'm setting, the demand curve is above average total cost. I know my profits have to be positive. I don't know, I don't have a calculator and my mental math is bad. I should at least be guessing between A and D here. So this is where when I'm taking these multiple choice exams, sometimes if you can remember some concepts that help you rule some answers out, that can at least improve ones that you're not sure on. I can get a better guess. It's not ideal, but it's better than just random guess. So, I could ask you for profits. I could ask you for the price, the quantity they're setting. I actually here could also ask you for what's the markup of this firm. So if I'm looking at this, the markup is the difference between price and marginal cost. So my price was 80. My marginal cost, that was 40. So the difference there, 80 minus 40 would be my markup of also 40. Just happens to work out to be two of those values are the same. That doesn't always have to be the case. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. So if I'm looking here, we already answered the markup question. What would the excess capacity of this firm be? So when we're comparing the excess capacity, I'll do this problem and then I'll show you something that could make it a little bit harder. If I'm looking at excess capacity, I'm comparing the quantity of the monopolist to the competitive market to what point? So we said, where is the efficient scale of production? Perfectly competitive firms get there in the long run. Right? They end up at the minimum point of the average total cost curve. So that minimum point of my average total cost curve here is right at this value of 60. So this quantity of 26. So my excess capacity is going to be the difference between the quantity that a monopolistic competitive market chooses and the quantity that is the efficient scale of production or that lowest possible point in the middle of the average total cost curve. So if you want to think about it this way, I'll write this out here actually, because I want to show you something that could change. Okay. So let's say instead I had something like this. So let's define excess capacity. I'll write it out because typing it in words a little bit goofy, right? So this was the quantity that the monopolistically competitive market's going to choose, minus that quantity was the efficient scale, or we could kind of think about that as that minimum point of the average total cost curve. What was my quantity? Okay. So let's say I had an example where I've got something like this. Okay. So what do I want? So here's my average total cost curve. Let's say I've got demand looks something like this. Here's my marginal revenue. Okay. So if I was in the short run, and here I think I drew it so profits are about zero, but it doesn't matter if they're positive or profit to make this point. I would choose that quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. We then go up to our demand curve to set the price. So even here you can kind of see maybe there's a small gap in between price and average. Maybe profits are negative, we're in the short run. But what would our excess capacity be? So what we don't do is compare it to the point where marginal cost is equal to demand. Okay? In the long run, that point would be similar to the depiction I had in the final exam review because that was a depiction of the long run. But in the short run, maybe that point where marginal cost hits demand, it won't necessarily be at the minimum point of average total cost. Okay? So we're not comparing the quantity of the monopolistically competitive market to the point where supply is equal to demand or marginal cost is demand. We're comparing it to the lowest possible point or the minimum of our average total cost. Why do I know this is the minimum point of average total cost? Marginal cost always intersects average total cost at its lowest possible point. This is kind of something that we reviewed in Module 9. So I would actually be comparing here that efficient scale of production wouldn't quite be the same as where demand hits marginal costs. Okay. So when I'm looking at excess capacity, it's comparing the monopolistically competitive quantity to that minimum, the quantity that puts me at the minimum point of my average total cost. That, do we have any questions on that? Okay. All right. So if we then kind of move to that next question, what would, and here I'm going to delete this stuff so we can get this, there we go. So if I'm looking at the same graph, what would deadweight loss be? This is going back, I mean, we're almost going back to like module 5 here. So where is total surplus maximized? What type of market? Perfectly competitive. So we said earlier the perfectly competitive point was out here at that price of 60, quantity of 26, total surplus. So anytime we talk about any surplus, it's the difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs. For the market, what represents marginal benefits? Demand. What represents our marginal costs? Supply, or here we've got the firm's marginal costs. So like if I had to draw it out, total surplus, like it's not even all in this graph, it's the difference between the demand curve and this marginal cost, right? It'd be all this area. Now, if I have a monopolistically competitive firm, they restricted the quantity to 20. So for every unit from 20 to 26, I'm losing the surplus that I would have seen from those units. What would the surplus from every unit be? The difference between that demand and supply curve. So my deadweight loss from being at this quantity with a monopolistically competitive market would be the area in between demand and those marginal costs, which would be this triangle here. So what? The height of our triangle, we go from 40 to 80, so that's 40. The width of this triangle, we're going from 20 to 26, so that would be 6. So what? 40 times 6 is 240. That's my deadweight loss, right? What I need to do is the area of a triangle, so multiply it by 1/2. So I should get what? 120 there. Now, one thing to point out here, what will the height of my deadweight loss triangle always be? Someone said it. Well, what's the top of that triangle? It was my price, the bottom, marginal cost. The height of that deadweight loss triangle will always be my markup. Part of deadweight loss was coming from the markup. What was the other part coming from? The fact that we were restricting quantity, or that we had some excess capacity. Any questions? I know I kind of verbally saying this, so hopefully you're taking notes and writing this down, but you're just finding the area of kind of that triangle, or the area in between the marginal cost and demand curve. For all of those quantities, the monopolistic competitive firm is not producing relatively for the competitive firm. Any other questions over anything related to those before we move on to, I think there's probably another graph or something here. Okay. Oh, so these are good ones to review. So not a graph, but I'm giving you some values. So this is where we're going to have to use equations to think about this. So I give you the quantity, marginal revenue, marginal cost, average total, average variable, and the price the firm is charging. So here, what tells me whether or not profits are positive or negative? Profits are positive if what? Price is above average total cost. My price here, I'm told, is 85. My average total cost is 100. So profits are negative. Price is below average total cost. Okay. So I know that I've got negative profits because price is below my average total cost. So the next decision I have to make is, do I shut down or stay open? I shut down if the price is what? Below my average variable cost. Okay. And then consequently, I would stay open if price is above my average variable cost, right? Even if profits are negative. So here, is my price of 85 above or below my average variable costs? 85, is that above or below 90? Below. So I should do what? Shut down here. If I shut down, what's the equation I actually would use for profits? It's not our typical profit equation because I'm not selling anything. But why do I know I'm in the short run here? Well, A, profits aren't zero, right? But there's also a difference between my average total and average variable costs. So what I need to do, if I shut down, we said profits are negative, I still have to pay my fixed costs. It doesn't matter if I produce nothing, I still have to pay those. So we had an equation that actually calculated our fixed cost for us. So we said average fixed is fixed cost divided by quantity. So fixed cost would be my average fixed times quantity. Okay. We then said, what is my average fixed cost? It's the difference between my average total and my average variable, right? Average variable plus average fixed gives me my average total. So this would be my average fixed cost. My profit equation, if I shut down, is simply taking the number of units that I'm looking at, quantity, multiplying it by the difference between my average total and average variable cost at that quantity. So here, I was given these, right? My average total cost is 100. My average variable costs are 90. And the quantity that I'm looking at is 20, right? So just to maybe put this on one line here. This would be how I kind of calculate my profits if I shut down. So this is what, negative 200. Now the reason why it's negative, I should have technically read that it's negative fixed costs. So there's really a negative sign in front of everything. But, we knew they were negative right away. I should have ruled out C because if price is below average total cost, we said initially the whole reason why we were deciding if we should stay open or shut down is because profits were negative. So I could have ruled out C right away. Now it's a matter of getting everything kind of plugged in my equation. Did I make a mistake?
Yeah.
What value did I look at that's wrong? Oh, it's not 20. That would help. 25. So that gives me 250. Okay. Any questions on this idea? Okay. Now, if I did stay open, just to kind of make this point, now my profit equation, if I stay open, it's just kind of our typical profit equation. So it'll be what? 25 times 85 minus 100. So I don't know what, 250 plus 125. I think this would be negative 375 if I'm doing math in my head correct there. Someone tell me if I'm not, but I think so, right? So if I stayed open, what were true about my profits? They were actually lower, right? They were a larger loss. So this is the reason why I should shut down. But I don't have to prove this to myself every time. I can just remember this rule of is price above or below average variable costs. Now, if I had the same sort of setup, but I now give you, I think the only thing I changed here is that the average variable costs are 80. Okay. Well, sorry, before I move on, any questions on this before we keep moving? So if my average variable costs are now 80, price is still below average total, so I know my profits will be negative, but price is now above average variable, so the firms are going to stay open. Right? So we've got these negative profits, right? In the long run, if profits are negative, what did we say every firm's going to choose, or sorry, what are some firms going to choose to do? Exit the market. So right away, we know if profits are negative in the short run, moving towards the long run, some firms exit. If some firms exit, what happens to the remaining firms? What are they going to see an increase in? Their demand curve, right? So as firms exit, essentially we can think about this as maybe, I'll give you some intuition, but I'll kind of draw it out here. So let's say we started out at a point where I've got marginal costs, I've got my demand curve, I've got my marginal revenue. We're at this quantity, charging this price. And we were at a point where we were below average total cost, so profits were negative. If profits are negative, each firm, right, some firms are going to exit. The remaining firms, they're going to get a now higher portion of the overall demand curve until we get to a higher demand curve, which would then kind of put us on this higher marginal revenue curve. where that price is exactly equal to my average total cost, and I get profits of 0. So anytime we have negative profits, firms enter the market. What does that do? Well, it increases the quantity that each firm is producing of the remaining firms, but it also increases the price that they can get away with charging. Now, the intuition, if you can draw this out all the time and prove this to yourself, but as firms exit, is there more or less competition than before? Less. So can the remaining firms get away with charging a higher or lower price than before? Higher, right? And there's fewer firms. You can kind of think about it as overall demand hasn't changed. There's just fewer firms splitting it. So every firm is going to sell more units. So the intuition can kind of lead you to these outcomes as well. But we can also draw this out if this helps, right? To kind of solidify this idea. So this is where giving some, so before I give a little advice, any questions on this? And then, any question that we're looking at here, if I had an example where profits were negative, firms exited, quantity price went up, I could also do what happens if profits are positive. Firms will enter, demand goes down, price and quantity go down. Okay. So anytime you're working through these questions, always think about, well, what if it was the reverse is true? So here's where I'll try to give you a few study tips. And I always like to think about this. So I was having a discussion yesterday.